Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you, amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. Thank you so much. Now let the lights soften, let your body relax, and let your breathing slow down. Settle in and sink into the stories that follow. Wishing you a peaceful night and a good sleep. Behind the drywall, I stepped out of my battered old sedan, the biting chill of a late afternoon in suburban Connecticut seeping through my thin sweater and making me shiver involuntarily. The Thompson estate loomed before me, nestled among ancient gnarled oaks, a grand colonial structure that felt strangely distant and cold despite the warm amber light spilling from its windows. I'm Chloe, a college student desperate for tuition money, and this babysitting gig seemed like a godsend until the moment I actually crossed the threshold. Mrs. Thompson, a woman with a face tight with perpetual tension and dark circles under her eyes as if she hadn't slept in years, greeted me with a barrage of frantic instructions. She wouldn't look me in the eye, her hands nervously clutching an expensive leather handbag as she repeated, over and over, that the two children, Lily and Toby, had already eaten and that I was strictly forbidden from going up to the attic. Mr. Thompson stood behind her, preoccupied with his wristwatch, offering only a curt nod before they both hurried out for a gala in the city. The sound of the front door clicking shut echoed through the hollow hallway, leaving me alone with two children in a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of unease that I couldn't quite put into words. The evening began normally enough, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. Lily and Toby were well-behaved but unnervingly silent. They sat on the living room rug working on a puzzle, without the usual bickering or playfulness of children their age. Occasionally, Toby would look up toward the grand staircase that led to the upper floors, where the shadows seemed to swallow the polished wood. When I asked him if something was wrong, he simply shook his head and whispered that the friend in the ceiling was sleeping and we shouldn't make any noise. The comment sent a cold ripple down my spine, but I laughed it off, chalking it up to the overactive imagination of a 6-year-old. However, as night fully descended upon the house, strange sounds began to manifest. At first, it was a light scratching, like an animal scurrying across the rafters, but gradually, it shifted into heavy, deliberate, and rhythmic footsteps. I sat on the sofa, trying to focus on my textbook, but my hearing was strained to catch every minute creak vibrating from the attic above. By 10 o'clock, after I had finally tucked the children into bed, curiosity and fear pushed me toward the wooden stairs. Every step I took felt like an intrusion, the floorboards groaning under my weight in the dead silence. Standing before the small, inconspicuous door to the attic, I noticed a pungent, nauseating odor wafting through the cracks, the scent of mildew, rotting food, and something human that hadn't been washed in a very long time. My hand trembled as I touched the doorknob. It was ice cold. Ignoring Mrs. Thompson's warning, I turned the lock and pushed the door open. A wave of stagnant, hot air hit my face. Under the weak light of my phone's flashlight, I realized with horror that the attic wasn't just a storage space for old furniture. In a dark corner behind some large cardboard boxes, a filthy mattress was laid out neatly on the floor. Surrounding it were dozens of empty food cans, old newspapers strangely collaged onto the wooden walls, and most revoltingly, rows of cups filled with a murky yellow liquid. My heart hammered against my ribs as the realization set in. Someone had been living here, directly above the Thompsons' heads, and they either had no idea or worse, were hiding it. The bile rose in my throat when I spotted an old smartphone sitting alone on the mattress. I picked it up. It had no passcode. As the blue light flickered on, I nearly dropped it in terror. In the Messages app, there was a single unnamed conversation filled with surreptitious photos. There were photos of Lily sleeping, Toby playing in the garden, Mrs. Thompson changing in her bedroom through a tiny slit in the ceiling, and the final photo, taken only 10 minutes ago, a shot of my own back while I was sitting in the living room. He had been right behind me. He had been watching my every move from the shadows since the moment I entered this house. The accompanying text made my skin crawl. This one looks delicious today. She's coming up now. And he's watching you through the closet slats. A surge of fury and disgust erupted within me as I realized I was being toyed with by a nameless voyeur. I raced downstairs, intent on grabbing the children and fleeing the house immediately. But when I burst into Toby's room, he was gone. His bed was empty, his teddy bear lying forgotten on the floor. I screamed his name in a panic, my voice cracking in the dark hallways. Suddenly, from inside the built-in closet, I heard a tiny, muffled giggle. I lunged at the door and flung it open, but instead of Toby, I found a small hole carved into the back wall of the closet, leading directly into the house's ventilation system. Deep within that darkness, a pair of bloodshot, crazed eyes stared back at me. A skeletal hand with blackened fingernails reached out, slowly bringing a finger to its lips in a shush gesture. He was holding Toby inside the walls. Pure instinct took over. I didn't think about my own safety as I lunged into the crawl space, fighting to pull Toby away from that monster's grip. The man hissed, a guttural, non-human sound, his strength surprising for someone so gaunt. During the struggle, I grabbed a heavy lamp from the bedside table and swung it with all my might at his arm. A shriek of pain echoed through the vents, and Toby seized the chance to scramble out toward me. I gathered him in my arms, locked the bedroom door, and used my entire body weight to shove a heavy dresser against it. Outside, the sound of scratching wood and a low, rhythmic thudding continued as he beat against the walls, screaming that we were his property. With shaking hands, I dialed 911, sobbing as I told the operator what was happening while I heard him trying to pry the drywall apart from behind the headboard. When the police finally arrived and subdued the intruder, a middle-aged former gardener who had been reported missing 2 years prior, the truth that emerged was even more infuriating. The Thompsons knew someone was in the attic. They had heard the noises, noticed the missing food, and seen the shadows. But out of fear of anonymous threats and a desperate, pathetic need to maintain their perfect reputation, they chose to stay silent, appeasing him by letting him exist like a ghost in their home. They hadn't hired me to babysit. They had hired me to be a distraction, a human sacrifice to keep him occupied while they enjoyed their lavish party. Seeing the vacant, defensive expressions on the Thompsons' faces when they returned to a house full of police officers, I felt a level of loathing I didn't know I was capable of. The intruder was arrested on multiple counts of burglary, kidnapping, and assault, but the psychological scarring left on me was permanent. The messages on that phone, the voyeuristic angles of the photos, and the phantom sensation of eyes peering down from every ceiling tile haunted my every waking hour. I had to transfer schools, move out of the state, and undergo years of intensive therapy. Now, whenever I enter a new building, my first instinct isn't to look at the decor. It's to look up at the ceiling, terrified that behind the drywall, someone is smiling and recording my every breath. The betrayal of the Thompsons and the malice of the man in the attic shattered my trust in the world, leaving a cold, hollow space that no amount of light can ever truly warm. Knocking from within. The sound of tires grinding against the leaf-covered dirt road of Woodridge echoed in brittle, scraping bursts, as if the ground itself were groaning beneath the weight of the old car I was driving. My name is Clara, a psychology major, and tonight I had taken a babysitting job for the Sterling family. Woodridge was not an unfamiliar place to those living in the suburbs of Massachusetts, but the Sterling house stood completely apart at the very end of a narrow cul-de-sac, where ancient maple trees intertwined overhead to form a canopy that blotted out what little remained of the fading dusk. When I stepped out of the car, the first sensation that hit me was a silence so complete it rang in my ears. There were no birds, no wind, only the cold breath rising from the nearby marshes, carrying the stench of rotting wood and moss. The house loomed before me, a decaying Victorian structure, its windows like hollow, soulless eyes fixed upon me, as though waiting for something I could not yet name. Mrs. Sterling greeted me at the door with a smile that I could only describe as hastily painted on. Her eyes did not smile at all. They darted nervously over my shoulder, as if she feared an uninvited guest might be standing right behind her. Mr. Sterling stood just beyond her, silently adjusting his tie, his face rigid and lifeless, like a stone effigy. They handed me a short list of emergency phone numbers and gave me a single instruction that sent a chill straight through my spine. No matter what happens, never let Lily out of your sight. And especially, if you hear knocking from inside the walls, turn the television on as loud as possible. Before I could ask a single question, they hurried out the door and into their car, leaving me alone in the vast foyer as shadows began creeping along the walls. Lily, their 6-year-old daughter with pallid skin and long black hair, stood at the foot of the staircase. Her wide eyes stared directly at me, yet seemed to pass straight through me, focused on some undefined void behind my back. The evening began under a suffocating blanket of silence. Lily did not speak. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor and drew. I tried to engage her, asking about her pictures, but she merely slid the stack of paper toward me. My heart tightened when I saw the drawings, crudely rendered in black and gray crayon. Every picture depicted the same figure, a woman in a long dress, unnaturally tall and thin, with a face that was nothing more than a smooth, blank void. Lily called her the faceless mother. She told me the woman lived in the abandoned house behind the garden, hidden from the kitchen window by thick, overgrown trees. The casual innocence in Lily's voice as she explained that the faceless mother often stood outside her bedroom window at night sent a cold current up my spine. I tried to reassure her that it was only a dream, but Lily looked at me with an expression far too old for a child and said quietly, "She doesn't like you being here, Clara." Around 9 o'clock, as I was preparing milk for Lily, a sound stopped me cold. Knock. 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 The noise was dry and hollow, not coming from the front door or the back door, but from inside the wooden wall beside the fireplace. I remembered Mrs. Sterling's warning and quickly turned on the television, but the noise from the screen could not mask the truth. The knocking was moving. It traveled in a straight line along the wall, toward the staircase, and then stopped exactly where Lily was sitting. She did not look frightened. She tilted her head up toward the ceiling and smiled, a warped, unnatural smile no child should ever wear. A surge of anger rose in me, not fear but fury, at the realization that the Sterlings had deceived me. They knew something was wrong with this house. They knew what their daughter was facing, and yet they had calmly walked away, leaving a stranger to confront it alone. Curiosity tangled with terror, driving me to take a flashlight and step into the backyard once Lily had fallen asleep on the sofa. The abandoned house Lily had mentioned emerged from a tangle of thorny brush, a rotting ruin slowly being consumed by the forest. When I stepped inside, the stench of decay and animal waste made me gag. On the peeling walls, I froze in horror at the sight of thousands of images of the faceless woman, identical to Lily's drawings, but here they had been made with a dark, dried substance that reeked of iron. In the center of the main room, I found an old phone, its screen cracked but still powered on. There was only one video saved on it, recorded in night vision mode. In the footage, I saw myself sleeping in my apartment downtown, from a week earlier. Someone had been watching me. Someone had chosen me. The Sterlings had not hired me by chance through an app. They had been instructed to bring me here. I ran back to the Sterling house, my breath tearing from my lungs in panic. When I burst into the living room, Lily was gone. The attic door, which had been firmly locked, now hung open, swaying in the cold draft seeping through the ceiling. I climbed the rickety stairs, each step feeling like I was sinking deeper into a trap with no escape. In the attic, Lily stood with her back to me, facing a corner drenched in pitch-black darkness. She was speaking to something, a tall, emaciated shadow drooping down from the rafters. When my flashlight swept across it, the shadow vanished, leaving Lily alone, her eyes now nothing but white. She began making the knocking sound from her own throat. Knock. The sound now came from inside the child herself. Revulsion surged to its peak when I finally understood the depth of her parents' selfishness. They had used their own daughter as a vessel, as part of a pact with an ancient entity bound to Woodridge, trading her for wealth and status. I rushed forward, scooped Lily into my arms, and ran, but the doors of the Sterling house slammed shut, locking themselves from the outside. The knocking erupted everywhere at once, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, forming a symphony of madness. The drawings of the faceless woman began to writhe, as if struggling to escape the paper and step into reality. In my most desperate moment, I smashed the study window with the flashlight and fled into the torrential rain that had just begun to pour, Lily clutched tightly against me. I drove recklessly to the nearest police station, ignoring the stream of anonymous threats flooding my phone. When the police arrived at the Sterling house, it was completely empty. There was no sign of the Sterlings, no evidence of a struggle, and the abandoned house behind the garden appeared to have never existed at all. There was only an empty lot riddled with deep, yawning pits. The officers looked at me with suspicion, even pity, as though I were a delusional patient unraveling under a psychotic break. But I knew what I had seen. I knew the sensation of those faceless hands as they nearly touched my shoulder in the attic. The Sterling family had vanished, taking their monstrous secrets with them, leaving Lily and me in the care of social services. The months that followed became a long procession of haunting days. Lily never spoke again. She sat in corners and clawed at the walls with her fingernails, producing steady knock sounds until all 10 fingers bled. Every night, lying in my new apartment, I still hear the knocking. It is not at the door, it is right behind my headboard. I turn the television up as loud as it will go, but the sound slips into my dreams, reminding me that escape is only an illusion. The faceless mother is not in Woodridge. She is in my mind, in every drawing Lily ever made, and she is waiting for a moment of weakness to take my face and add me to her collection of forgotten souls. The rage of watching the guilty walk free, and the grief of seeing a child destroyed, eroded me day by day, until I understood that some crimes are never brought into the light, and some monsters were the faces of respectable parents. Dead memories of Blackwood. The sound of tires grinding over rotting, dry pine needles rang out sharply, tearing through the unnerving silence of the mountainous forests of northern Oregon. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to suppress the unease churning in my stomach as I glanced at the map for directions. The Sterling family's house was far more remote than I had expected, completely cut off from the nearest town by a winding dirt trail where towering fir trees intertwined overhead, blocking even the faint afternoon light of early evening. My name is Claire, a psychology student desperately in need of money to cover my final semester, and the offer to babysit a boy named Silas for a 3-day weekend, at an unusually high rate, was something I simply could not refuse. But the moment the rusted iron gates of the estate came into view, I wished I had never clicked submit on my application. The house was an old Gothic structure, its peeling gray paint and windows resembling hollow eye sockets that seemed to stare straight at me. Mrs. Sterling greeted me at the door with a smile that looked painfully forced onto her pale face. She did not politely invite me inside, but stood frozen in the foyer, repeatedly glancing toward the pitch-black forest behind the house. She rattled off instructions about Silas's diet in a hurried, almost panicked tone, and emphatically warned me that I was never, under any circumstances, to open the second-floor windows after sunset. Mr. Sterling never even showed his face. I only caught sight of his tall silhouette standing motionless in a dark corner of the staircase, his eyes glinting strangely in the shadows before the two of them hurried away in their luxury car, leaving me alone with 6-year-old Silas in a space thick with the smell of damp wood and an icy sense of isolation. Silas was a beautiful child, but he carried a melancholy far beyond his years. He did not play with toys or watch cartoons. Instead, he sat silently in an old armchair, his large, round eyes fixed on a blank wall, as if watching a film visible only to him. The first night passed in a suffocating silence, so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat and the steady tapping of dry branches against the metal roof. I tried to make conversation with Silas, but he merely looked at me and whispered that they did not like my presence in the house. When I asked who they were, Silas pointed toward the forest, where fog was beginning to seep through the cracks like long, gray fingers. That night, as I lay on the sofa in the living room, I fell into a nightmare so vivid that my clothes were soaked with sweat when I woke. I saw myself walking deep into the forest, barefoot, stepping on sharp thorns, and ahead of me was Silas holding hands with a tall, faceless entity whose skin was ashen, corpse-like gray. When I jolted awake, I realized the second-floor window, the very one Mrs. Sterling had strictly forbidden me to open, was wide open, letting in a freezing gust of air carrying the stench of damp earth and decay. I ran upstairs, my heart racing, and found Silas standing before the open window, staring into the impenetrable darkness of the forest, his lips murmuring tuneless melodies. Frustration surged as I tried to call the Sterlings to report Silas's condition, but the phone emitted only incomprehensible static before losing signal entirely. I felt trapped, abandoned in some deranged scenario concocted by a wealthy yet deeply disturbed family. By the second day, things grew even worse. Silas began exhibiting increasingly strange behavior, drawing twisted shapes on the walls, headless figures and blood-red circles. The constant sensation of being watched from behind, whenever I walked down the hallway, nearly drove me mad. I noticed scratch marks appearing on the wooden doors and black muddy footprints, small, unmistakably human, leading from the attic down to Silas's room. When I checked the attic, I found an old phone buried beneath a thick layer of dust. It contained hundreds of messages sent to an unknown number, all reading variations of the same thing. Is it its turn today? The forest is hungry. The child will soon belong to us. A wave of revulsion washed over me as I realized I was probably not the first babysitter to come here, and that those before me had vanished without a trace. My discomfort reached its breaking point when I confronted Silas, but the boy merely stared at me with empty eyes and spoke in a low, hollow voice that did not belong to a child. "You will just become part of the forest too, Claire." That night, The fog was so thick I could no longer see the fence surrounding the house. Scraping sounds and soft, giggling laughter echoed from within the walls. I clutched Silas tightly in the living room, desperately trying to barricade the doors with wooden planks, but terror strangled any remaining rational thought. I drifted in and out of sleep, and this time in my dream, I saw the trees in the forest extending their roots like serpents into the house, wrapping around Silas's legs and dragging him away. I woke with a start to a heart-rending scream. The living room was empty. Silas was gone. The front door stood wide open, revealing a pitch-black void leading into the forest. I ran outside in a frenzy, shouting his name in desperation, but only my own echo answered me, along with the wind whistling through the leaves. I ran to the forest's edge, where the ground began to sink, and saw Silas's small jacket hanging from a dead branch, torn and stained with a dark liquid. At that very moment, the lights in the house flared on brightly, then went out completely. I realized I was standing alone in nothingness, and in the darkness, hundreds of tiny, glimmering eyes stared back at me from the bases of ancient trees. When the police arrived the next morning, responding to an automated distress signal from the house, they found no trace of Silas. The house was completely empty, no furniture, no signs of life. Worse still, when I tried to explain what had happened, they looked at me with suspicion and disgust. Records showed that the Sterling family had died in a horrific accident 10 years earlier, and that the boy named Silas had never existed in any official documents. They found Silas's blood on my clothes, something I could not explain, and accused me of murder and disposal of a body. The truth about the child's disappearance into the forest became an unsolved mystery, and I was trapped in a waking nightmare. Every night in my cell, I still hear Silas's whispers from the corners of the darkness. "The forest is still waiting for you, Claire." The haunting image of the boy's empty eyes and the sensation of ashen hands pulling him away through the fog have become a permanent wound in my soul, forcing me to realize that there are truths far more terrifying than death, and that I am the final victim of a ritual game this forest has sustained for decades. The face in the dark. I stood frozen, staring at the old three-story Victorian wooden house nestled beneath the bare oak trees of a small town in Massachusetts, a place where the fog seemed to never fully lift. My name is Riley, a student who had just moved here and was desperately short on money to cover the exorbitant cost of living in the United States. When Mrs. Miller posted an ad looking for a babysitter for her young daughter, Beatrice, nicknamed B, offering a salary twice the local average, I seized the opportunity immediately, without questioning the reason behind such generosity. Mrs. Miller greeted me at the door with an unervingly exhausted expression. Her eyes kept darting around as if she were watching something invisible, and her hand was ice cold when it touched my shoulder. Her instructions were brief and strange. B was a sensitive child who loved playing hide and seek, and under no circumstances was I to allow her to stand in front of any mirror in the house after sunset. Before I could ask why, she rushed off in her car, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of a house heavy with the scent of rotting wood and candle wax. B was a beautiful child, but there was a sorrow about her far beyond her years. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, clutching an old cloth doll with no eyes. Throughout the afternoon, she didn't speak a single word. Occasionally, she would point toward the dark corners of the hallway and whisper, "The faceless man is coming." I tried to reassure myself that it was nothing more than childish imagination, but the atmosphere inside the house began to shift as the last traces of daylight faded. Large mirrors hung on nearly every wall, all of them concealed beneath heavy black velvet drapes I hadn't noticed when I first arrived. Now they seemed to tremble subtly, as if something behind them were stirring. As B and I walked toward the kitchen, I accidentally knocked the cloth covering a tall hallway mirror to the floor, and that was when the nightmare truly began. Instead of reflecting B and me, the mirror revealed another scene entirely. A decaying room stained with dried blood along the walls. Standing directly behind me in the reflection was a tall figure wearing a worn black suit. Where its face should have been was nothing but a smooth, pallid expanse of skin, blank, stretched, and grotesquely wrong. I screamed and spun around, but there was nothing behind me. Only B stood there, staring at me with hollow eyes as she whispered, "He likes your face." At that moment, the power throughout the house cut out completely, plunging everything into suffocating darkness. I fumbled through my bag for a flashlight, but its weak beam only made the shadows feel more monstrous. Heavy footsteps echoed from the upper floor, accompanied by the sound of fingernails scraping slowly against wood. I grabbed B's hand and ran toward the front door, only to discover that every exit had been mysteriously locked from the outside. A surge of anger and dread washed over me as I realized the truth. The Miller family had used me as a sacrifice, an offering to some malevolent entity bound to this house. As panic set in, I noticed that every family photograph lining the walls had been carved out where the faces should have been, an obvious detail I had somehow missed in daylight. We fled upstairs and barricaded ourselves in the bathroom, the only room without a mirror. But as I slammed the door shut, I noticed steam rising from the bathtub and condensing on the cracked glass of a small handheld mirror lying on the floor. Slowly, words began to appear across its fogged surface, written in blood. Underscore, I need a new face. Underscore, the faceless apparition emerged from the darkness, not through the door, but crawling out from the fractures in the glass itself. It moved closer, its icy breath grazing my neck. I felt a slick, clammy hand press against my cheek, peeling at my skin as if removing a mask. The pain and terror shattered my sanity. In blind desperation, I grabbed a shard of broken glass and drove it into the entity. It shrieked, a sound not human, but a piercing chorus of countless trapped souls. Amid the chaos, I found a narrow emergency exit through B's bedroom window. I scooped her up and leapt outside, crashing into a pile of dead leaves below, my face scraped and bleeding. I ran blindly toward the main road, where a police patrol car happened to be passing by. When I told them everything in a hysterical rush, the officers exchanged skeptical glances. They informed me that the house had been abandoned for years after a horrific incident in which a man went mad, removed his own face, and then murdered his entire family. No one named Miller had ever lived there. When I turned to look at B, the child I thought I had saved, she smiled at me, a grin stretching impossibly wide across her face. Then she faded into the fog, leaving behind only the eyeless cloth doll resting in my hands. That night destroyed my life completely. The scars on my cheeks never faded, but that was not the worst of it. The worst part is that since then, I have never dared to look into a mirror again. Whenever I pass by a reflective surface, I see the faceless figure standing just behind me, waiting patiently. I lost the ability to communicate, lived in constant paranoia, and eventually was committed to long-term psychiatric care. The realization that I had been deceived into serving a twisted ritual, and that poor B was likely nothing more than bait, fills me with unending rage and grief. I have come to understand that there are entities in this world that desire nothing except human suffering, and I was the perfect victim for their cruel amusement. Even now, whenever I hear the sound of breaking glass, I tremble, knowing that he is still there, within the world of mirrors, waiting for the moment I let my guard down so he can complete the final exchange of faces.